your half square triangles a little wonky, or you've heard that trimming them will actually help your blocks go together more easily and neatly, but every time you go to trim your half square triangles, you don't really have anything there to trim? Why is that? In this video, I'm going to explain what the math really is behind all those recommended starting sizes for making half square triangle units. And even if you're not a math person, just follow along because it will give you a little bit of insight into the next thing, which is what other things besides that starting square size affect the size of your half square triangle units before you trim them. In other words, how do you make sure that they're actually big enough to trim? And then we'll talk about what sizes you might want to cut those starting squares and how to look for those pieces in the pattern. So if you do want to cut them a little bigger, you know where to find it in the pattern and make those changes. Let's get started with that math. I've drawn this little diagram here of the way that we usually make half square triangle units. You cut a square, a certain size is directed, and then you draw a line, and then you sew a 1/4 inch away from either side of that line. I've done that here. Then you cut on that line and then open up 2 of these, and then you have your half square triangle unit. So that's what we're looking at here, the starting square. And then I've blown up this corner because this is where the calculation of how much bigger that square needs to be than what you want your finished half square triangle unit to be. Here is that bottom corner blown up. And you know that you are supposed to sew this a 1/4 inch away from the line. And if you know your math, we've drawn a right triangle here. So this is also a 1/4 inch. And then this is a mystery number X. And then using that great theorem by Pythagoras, we can say that a 1/4 inch, now don't let me lose you here, this is very brief math. We're going to say a 1/4 inch squared plus a 1/4 inch squared equals X squared. And then we're going to solve for X. And I've used decimals to solve this instead of using fractions, because if you don't, you end up with radical 2 in the answer, which is not helpful. But in the end, X equals 0.35355, which the nearest fraction to that is 3/8, which is 0.375. So you can see that this number 3/8 is already a little bigger than what this needs to be here. Now we're all done with the fancy math. What does this 0.375 or 3/8 of an inch mean here? Let's take it back to here. In our big diagram, this amount here from the seam to the cut corner needs to be 3/8 of an inch to account for the 1/4 inch seam here. So if you want your half square triangle unit before it's sewn into anything to be 2.5 inches, remember, because we need it to be a 1/2 inch bigger because of the 1/4 inch seams when it gets sewn into something else. So if we want that to be 2.5 inches and we need to add 3/8 inches to that, then that equals 2 7/8 inches. And you see this number, something and 7/8, often when you have a pattern that does not require the half square triangles to be trimmed. But most of the time, people round this up to the next full inch. That means there's an extra 1/8 of an inch added on out here, right? Because it's only 3/8 is taken up by the seam, an extra 1/8, so that when you go to trim it, there is a little bit extra so that you're able to trim things off and make your potentially wonky half square triangle look nice and neat. Okay, so that's it for math. If you've ever wondered what 7/8 versus 3 inches and why those charts out there, including I have one myself, you can get down in the comments. If you've ever wondered where that number is coming from, that's where it's coming from. But what happens if you followed all this? You've cut it the way it's supposed to. You've cut it 3 inches and you go to trim it And there is not more than 2.5 inches so that you can actually trim off the excess from your half square triangle. How does that happen? Well, there's one more factor here that matters, and that is whether this is really a 1/4 inch. If your seam is closer or further away, it actually affects this line over here, how much room you have in the edge of your half square triangle. How long this edge is makes for whether or not you can trim. And this, we do not even have to look at the math. I made up a few examples here to show you. We're going to walk through these so in real time so you can see. This first one, I've sewn as close as I possibly can to a scant 1/4 inch from that line. This one you can see is a little exaggeratedly beyond a scant 1/4 inch. And this one here is less than a scant 1/4 inch. I'm going to cut each of these, and these are 3-inch starting squares, and that's 3-inch starting squares are what are used usually to get a result so that you can trim it down to 2.5 inches. And we really only need one of each of these. I'm going to go press these and bring them right back. And already you can see that there is a difference in sizes. This is the one that I did as accurately as I could. And here is the one where I sewed a bigger than usual seam, and you can see it got used up. It's not as big as this one, whereas this one is slightly bigger. So if I were to use this one and I wanted to trim it to 2.5 inches, there is enough to just barely trim all the way around. And again, this one where I sewed really a scant 1/4 inch, beyond a scant 1/4 inch, you can see on this one, you can see has oodles of extra. But this one here, with the more than a 1/4 inch seam here, that just barely hits at 2.5 inches. So there really wouldn't be much to trim off. You could trim off the 2 corners, but it just barely hits. So if you were wanting to be able to trim it to make sure that you get those points just perfectly in the corners, and maybe you pressed and things are a little wonky, you're just not going to have enough room. So that seam allowance within your half square triangle units matters too. So if you're following patterns that tell you to trim your half square triangles and you are consistently having problems with that, you sew them, you cut them and sew them as they say, and you never seem to have enough to trim, then it's probably likely that you're sewing more than that scant 1/4 inch away from that line. And sewing that diagonal line is a little tricky. So what should you do? Well, you can cut those squares a little bit bigger. Just look through your pattern. For example, if it's a pattern that says something in 7/8 for those units that you're going to turn into half square triangles, you know that's a pattern where you're not actually going to have to trim. And if you do want to trim, you can bump it up to 1 inch or even 1 1/8 inches to give you a little bit extra in order to trim. If you've been following patterns that ask you to trim and you consistently really don't have anything to trim off those half square triangles, then there are 2 different things you could do. One, you could make a concerted effort to sew closer to that line, or 2, you could just cut those starting squares a little bigger. You just have to look through the pattern and find which pieces are going to be made into the half square triangle units and add 1/8 inch to them. Of course, you do want to check through the pattern to make sure that you are still going to have enough fabric to do that. And you probably want to do a couple tests to make sure that an extra 1/8 inch really does give you enough to trim. Finally, if trimming half square triangles is a little scary, then do check out this next video, which I show you how to trim half square triangles. Happy sewing!